They told you Africa was chaos before Europe showed up, that tribes were primitive, that kingdoms were savage, and that leaders were nothing but warlords with spears and superstition. But then you meet Shaka Zulu, and suddenly, that story falls apart. This wasn't some random chief waving a stick in the jungle. This was a strategist, a psychologist, a nation builder who rewired the entire concept of war. Before most of Europe even understood what Africa truly was, Shaka didn't just fight battles. He designed systems, logistics, discipline, intelligence, propaganda, all from the ground up. And that's exactly why they buried his story under layers of myth and madness. Because if you knew who Shaka really was, you'd start asking dangerous questions, like, how did a man with no European training outthink entire empires? And why was his brilliance rewritten as brutality? See, the Western world couldn't handle the truth about Shaka Zulu. They needed him to look like a monster, not a mastermind. So the colonizers told their version, painting him as bloodthirsty, deranged, unstable. They needed a villain to justify invasion, and in the 1800s, Shaka was the perfect target. But if you strip away the propaganda, you see something else. You see a man who rose from nothing, an outcast child, born under scandal, and built one of the most disciplined armies Africa had ever seen. He turned scattered clans into a nation. He turned fear into fuel. He turned Zulu into power. When Shaka appeared on the scene, Southern Africa wasn't unified. It was dozens of small chiefdoms, family tribes, loosely connected, fighting small border disputes. Shaka looked at that and saw potential. He saw chaos, but he also saw opportunity. He once said, "A man who thinks ahead conquers tomorrow." And that was exactly what he did. He didn't just fight enemies. He studied them. He understood psychology before it was even a word in Western science. He watched how men broke in fear, how leaders froze in doubt. He weaponized human emotion. Every decision he made, from the shape of his shields to the rhythm of his marching songs, was a psychological weapon. Europe called him savage, but his strategies echoed through centuries, influencing how wars were fought far beyond Africa. His ideas would later be mirrored in Napoleon's mobility, Clausewitz's discipline, and even modern guerrilla warfare. But of course, they'll never tell you that, because how do you explain a man who rewrote military science while barefoot, with no books, no maps, no academies, just raw intellect and instinct? How do you explain that Africa birthed a war genius while Europe was still arguing about civilizing the continent? Shaka's rise wasn't luck, it was precision. He trained warriors not to fight, but to become the weapon. He created the Empire, an elite regiment system that turned ordinary farmers into unstoppable human machines. They didn't fight for plunder, they fought for purpose, to prove Africa could stand as one. But here's where it gets deep. The same colonizers who later used divide and conquer to tear Africa apart were the ones who studied Shaka's tactics and used them against his descendants. They feared him, they studied him, then they erased him, because if Shaka's story survived in its true form, it would destroy the myth of African inferiority forever. They needed Shaka to be remembered as crazy, not brilliant, not visionary, not revolutionary. So they twisted the narrative. They called his unification of tribes slaughter. They called his discipline cruelty. And they made sure to print that version in every British book about Africa for the next 100 years. But you can't bury truth forever. And now we're digging it back up. Because the real Shaka wasn't a monster. He was a mirror, a reflection of what happens when black genius isn't limited by someone else's script. He rewired war, nationhood, and fear itself. He took trauma and turned it into an empire, and he forced the world to look at Africa differently, even if they pretended not to. But the question is, how did one outcast son rise so fast, so high, that even the British Empire took notes? What exactly did Shaka do that terrified Europe into rewriting his story? That's what we're about to uncover. When Shaka was born, he was already marked for exile. The son of a Zulu chief, and a woman from another clan, his birth was considered a scandal, a stain on his father's honor. His mother, Nandi, was driven out, mocked, left to raise him alone in a world that wanted him gone. But that humiliation, that's what forged him. Every insult carved something sharp inside him. Every rejection built a wall of calculation. The boy who was never meant to lead would become the most feared commander Africa had ever seen. Shaka grew up among the Methwa, a neighboring people led by Chief Dingyuswayo, a man who saw something different in this quiet, intense young warrior. While others laughed at his ideas, Dingyuswayo listened. He gave Shaka command of a small regiment. Shaka didn't waste time. He stripped away everything that made old warfare predictable. The long throwing spears, the loose formations, the disorganized charges. He redesigned it all. He shortened the spear into the ikawa, a stabbing blade built for close combat. It was faster, deadlier, personal. When that steel hit flesh, it changed everything. He reorganized the army into disciplined units, each one with a chain of command, age groups, and ranks. Warriors were forbidden from marrying until they'd proven themselves. Shaka made battle a science of emotion. Control fear, control men. No drinking before war, no hesitation in charge, no retreat without orders. For the first time, African warfare wasn't about chaos, it was about precision. His soldiers moved as one body, one heartbeat, one will. And when that machine moved, entire villages disappeared before the enemy even realized what hit them. Word of his brilliance spread. Dingyuswayo's enemies fell, one by one, crushed by Shaka's new order. But fate moves fast in Africa's storms. Dingyuswayo was captured and killed by a rival chief, Zwide of the Nedwanwi. Shaka didn't mourn long. He calculated. He took command of the Methwa survivors, united them with his Zulu kin, and forged something new, the Zulu kingdom. What began as a handful of scattered clans turned into a force so organized that even colonial armies would later copy its structure. He built a capital, Kwabulawayo, the place of the killing, not because he loved blood, but because he knew fear was a weapon. Every wall, every spear, every drumbeat was psychological design. He wanted enemies to collapse before contact. When his army marched, dust filled the sky like storm clouds. The ground shook with the rhythm of feet. Witnesses said the sound alone broke men's spirits. That's not savagery, that's psychological warfare centuries ahead of its time. Shaka didn't just fight wars, he rewired identity. He taught his people to see themselves as Zulu first, not clan, not tribe, not family. That unity terrified neighboring chiefs. He absorbed them through fear, strategy, or alliance, whichever came first. His empire spread fast, swallowing territory across what is now KwaZulu-Natal. His power didn't just change Africa, it reshaped the continent's political map. The Methacane, or crushing, was born migrations, wars and reshuffling of entire nations sparked by the shockwave of one man's rise. But the British and Dutch later twisted that story too, turning it into proof that Africans were always killing each other. They left out the part where Shaka's brilliance had built the kind of power Europe feared to face head-on. You see, the reason they had to demonize him wasn't just his success, it was his innovation. Shaka Zulu was the first to merge military psychology with African spirituality. His warriors believed. They fought with ancestral protection. Every spear was blessed. Every march was ritual. He turned belief into armor. He understood morale the way modern generals study logistics. He knew men didn't fight for kings. They fought for purpose, for belonging. That's why even after his death, the Zulu war machine endured for generations. But Shaka's genius had a price. Power isolates. Paranoia grows. The line between protector and tyrant blurs. As the empire expanded, cracks began to form. Loyalty tested. Trust eroded. The same fire that built the Zulu kingdom now threatened to consume it. So how did the most brilliant strategist in African history lose control of his own creation? How does a man who mastered fear become ruled by it? After Shaka's death, the Zulu kingdom didn't collapse. It evolved. Dingaan took the throne, trying to distance himself from his brother's shadow. But every decision he made still echoed Shaka's blueprint. The army structure stayed, the discipline stayed, even the fear stayed. That's how deep Shaka's system ran. He didn't just build soldiers, he built psychology. Zulu identity had become a mindset, not just a flag. But here's where the game flipped. The British and Dutch settlers, watching from the edges, finally saw their opening. They moved into Natal, trading guns and promises with local chiefs, slowly tightening the noose. They called it commerce, but it was infiltration. They studied how Shaka united the Zulu and planned to reverse it, tribe by tribe, deal by deal. Divide, bribe, rule. That's how empires crumble. Dingaan thought he could handle them. He tried diplomacy with the Boers, Dutch farmers pushing east from the Cape, but those men didn't come to trade. They came to take. When they crossed Zulu land, Dingaan invited their leader, Piet Retief, to a feast. Then during the meeting, he had Retief and his entire party killed. Brutal, yes. But look closer. Dingaan was playing the only hand left to him. He'd watched the Europeans crush every kingdom that tried to negotiate. He knew peace treaties were death warrants, written in fancy ink. His move wasn't madness, it was survival. The Boers struck back. December 1838, the Battle of Blood River. 470 Boer fighters against more than 10,000 Zulu warriors. The Zulu were fearless, but the Boers had rifles, gunpowder, and wagons chained in a circle like a steel fortress. They called it a miracle when they won. They said God gave them victory, but the truth is simpler. Guns beat spears. It was the first real sign that the colonial storm had arrived. Still, even in defeat, Shaka's legacy refused to die. His tactics lived on. Decades later, under King Cetshwayo, the Zulu would face the full weight of the British Empire in 1879 and shock the world. At Isandlwana, 20,000 Zulu warriors destroyed a British army armed with rifles, cannons, and arrogance. Over 1,300 British soldiers died in a single afternoon. The empire that ruled half the planet was humiliated by African warriors, using the same formation Shaka invented: the bull's horns, the chest to engage, the horns to encircle, the loins to reinforce. It worked just like it had a century earlier. That victory shattered Europe's illusion of superiority. The British press didn't know how to explain it. They called it a tragedy, not a defeat. But everyone who knew history saw the ghost of Shaka standing on that battlefield. The man they called savage had outthought them long after he was gone. And that's when the erasure began in full force. Colonial historians started rewriting the narrative to make the victory look like a fluke, a lucky ambush. They pushed stories that painted Shaka as insane, bloodthirsty, incapable of complex thought. Because if Europe admitted the truth, that African genius once humbled their armies, the entire foundation of white supremacy would crack. They couldn't let that happen. So they turned Shaka into legend, myth, madness. They buried the receipts of his discipline, his reforms, his strategy. They wrote about his cruelty, never his creativity. They made him sound like a barbarian, with a big ego, not a reformer who built an empire from exile. But in the villages, the griots and elders kept the real story alive. They told their children how Shaka turned shame into strength, how he saw unity as Africa's shield. And that story survived colonization, Christianity, apartheid, everything. Because truth doesn't rot, it hides, it waits. But there's a deeper layer most people never talk about. Shaka didn't just invent tactics, he built the psychological template for resistance. His model of unity, through shared struggle, became the backbone for future African liberation movements. From Zulu war songs to the chants of anti-apartheid fighters, you can still hear his rhythm. The same discipline that once moved 10,000 warriors across a battlefield now moved millions across decades of oppression. So ask yourself, if one man's vision could echo for 200 years through war, rebellion, and freedom movements, what exactly were they so afraid we'd remember? They were afraid of the pattern. Shaka proved what happens when Africans stop fighting each other and start fighting with purpose. He showed that unity was more dangerous to empire than any weapon. That's why the colonizers didn't just kill leaders, they killed memory. They knew another Shaka could rise from knowledge, not birth. By the late 1800s, Britain had mastered the art of psychological colonization. They didn't need to erase Shaka's story, they needed to rewrite it. In textbooks, he became the Black Napoleon, a compliment that was really an insult. It implied imitation, not innovation. But Shaka came first. He was already using mobile regiments and tactical envelopment before Europe even saw him coming. In missionary schools, they taught African children that Shaka was a warning. Too proud, too violent. They never said too brilliant. That's how you disarm a people, make their heroes look insane, make genius sound dangerous. By the time the British fully occupied Natal, most locals were forced to learn about their own ancestors from white teachers who framed Zulu power as a mistake. The colonizers' greatest weapon wasn't the rifle, it was the story. Every history book written under colonial rule served the same purpose, to make Africa's golden age sound like chaos. They called the Mefficane tribal slaughter, but ignored that it was sparked by survival under external pressure, droughts, migrations, and European intrusion. Shaka didn't destroy Africa, he reorganized it. He saw a continent breaking and tried to forge it into strength. And that's what they couldn't allow, the idea that Africa could fix itself without Europe. Fast forward a century, apartheid, South Africa. White rulers still used the colonial version of Shaka's story to justify domination. They made movies, plays, and school lessons portraying him as blood-crazed, unpredictable, a barbarian who proved Africa needed civilization. But here's the irony. The same government that demonized him used his military principles to train its own army. They studied his strategies at their war colleges. They feared his legacy, but they couldn't deny its effectiveness. Meanwhile, in the townships and rural villages, old men still told Shaka's story by firelight, not the European one, the African one. They said he was a visionary who saw centuries ahead. They said his dream of a united Africa wasn't dead, just sleeping. And in that story, he wasn't a tyrant. He was the first African to understand the psychology of oppression. That division is more powerful than bullets. That's why modern movements started echoing his methods without even realizing it. When the ANC trained guerrilla fighters in exile, they used small mobile units, Shaka's Empire Reborn. When Pan-African leaders like Nkrumah and Nyerere preached unity, they were walking his path. When black activists in America talked about self-discipline, identity, and community protection, that was the spirit of the Zulu Code. The lesson of Shaka Zulu wasn't about war, it was about organization. He showed that structure beats chaos, unity beats fear, and purpose beats propaganda. But because his story was filtered through colonial eyes, the world learned the wrong moral. They told us Shaka's power led to destruction. The truth, his power was the blueprint for liberation. You were never meant to admire him. You were meant to fear becoming him. Because once you understand what he really did, how he used psychology, order, and courage to turn broken tribes into a superpower, you start to see through every lie the empire ever told about black leadership. So maybe the real question isn't why they erased Shaka Zulu. Maybe it's this: what happens the moment we remember him exactly as he was? Shaka's story didn't end with his death or the fall of the Zulu kingdom. It mutated into something bigger. His influence seeped into the bloodstream of African resistance, long after his name had been buried under colonial lies. What the British and the Dutch never understood is that when you erase a man like Shaka, you don't destroy him. You make him legend, and legends don't die. They multiply. Across southern Africa, oral historians carried his memory like contraband. They told the truth quietly, that the barbarian Europe feared had built one of the most efficient military systems ever seen on the continent. They whispered that the discipline he demanded wasn't cruelty, it was design, that the tears he caused weren't chaos. They were growing pains of a nation learning unity for the first time, that what Europeans called destruction was in reality a reordering of power. Colonial officers tried to trace that legacy, to stamp it out. They passed laws banning Zulu war songs, censored oral traditions, and punished teachers who tried to tell the true version. But it didn't matter, because Shaka's story wasn't written on paper. It was written in the culture, in the way Zulu men walked with pride, in the way warriors greeted each other with "Baye," hail the king. That word was more than respect, it was rebellion. In the early 20th century, as Europe's control deepened, African intellectuals started revisiting Shaka's legacy. Writers like Sol Plaatje and John Dube, the first president of the African National Congress, looked to the Zulu Empire not as a cautionary tale, but as proof that Africa had once built complex centralized states without European help. They understood that reclaiming Shaka's image was part of reclaiming Africa's soul. Then came apartheid, a system built on the exact opposite of Shaka's dream: division, hierarchy, and fear. The regime understood symbolism, so they weaponized his image again. In the 1980s, the South African Broadcasting Corporation produced a television series called Shaka Zulu. It aired worldwide, slickly made, full of drama, but it was propaganda. Funded by an apartheid government, terrified of rising black consciousness, it turned Shaka into a caricature, half genius, half monster. The acting was powerful, the costumes authentic, but the subtext was poison. To the world it looked like a tribute. To South Africans, it was a warning. The message was clear: this is what happens when black power goes too far. The series became a global hit, the first time most Westerners had ever heard Shaka's name. Yet what they saw wasn't truth. It was a colonial remix, designed to neutralize him even in death. And that worked for a while. But even distorted truth leaves a trail. In the townships, in the freedom songs, in the speeches of leaders like Steve Biko and later Nelson Mandela, the idea of Shaka-ness, that fearless, organized, defiant spirit, kept resurfacing. They saw what the colonizers didn't, that Shaka's legacy wasn't about empire, it was about self-definition. He taught Africans that they didn't need permission to command respect, that leadership could come from pain, not privilege, that unity could rise from ashes. That's what terrified the world powers, because they understood that once a people remember what they were before colonization, they stop begging and start building. The West was comfortable with an Africa that saw itself as broken, but Shaka's story, in its real form, was radioactive, proof that Africa once led the world in organization, innovation, and psychological warfare, that Africa didn't need saving, it needed remembering. And the deeper truth, Shaka wasn't just a military genius, he was one of the first Africans to practice what we'd now call nation branding. He used visual power, uniformity, ritual, performance to engineer pride. Every spear, every shield, every movement had symbolism. The Zulu Empire didn't just fight, they performed dominance. He understood that you win a war long before the first spear is thrown. You win it in the mind. That's why his soldiers were fearless. They didn't think they could lose. They were conditioned to believe they were the storm. That psychology didn't die with him. It re-emerged in every freedom movement across the continent. In the Mau Mau of Kenya, in the liberation wars of Zimbabwe and Angola, in the chants of Soweto, the idea that the oppressed could become the organized, that fear could turn to formation, that's pure Shaka. But there's still one truth that most people never face. Shaka didn't fight for revenge, he fought for control. Control of image, destiny, and narrative. He wanted Africa to define itself before anyone else could. And that, more than his wars, was what Europe feared most, Because when a people take back their story, they take back their power. So maybe Shaka Zulu wasn't just rewriting warfare. Maybe he was rewriting identity. Maybe the real battlefield wasn't land or blood at all. Maybe it was the mind. And if that's true, what happens when the descendants of the Zulu and the entire African diaspora finally see the war for what it really was? Because that's the war still being fought today, not with spears or rifles, but with narratives. The same empires that once called Shaka a savage now sell his image on t-shirts and streaming platforms, sanitized and stripped of meaning. The same nations that invaded Africa now teach his story in their textbooks, but never his strategy, never the part that shows he outthought them. It's historical laundering, and it's deliberate. The truth is, if students learned how Shaka actually operated, how he used speed, intelligence, logistics, and psychology to dismantle enemies far larger than him, they'd start asking dangerous questions. They'd start seeing through the myth that Africa was primitive. They'd realize that the techniques modern armies use today, rapid mobility, encirclement tactics, morale warfare, all had an African blueprint centuries before Europe industrialized them. Western historians often say Napoleon revolutionized warfare, but Shaka did what Napoleon did, with no cannons, no horses, no written manuals, just raw vision. He turned discipline into a culture and innovation into instinct. His empire formations anticipated blitzkrieg by over 100 years. That's not coincidence. That's genius. The world refuses to credit. And that's why when colonial writers like Nathaniel Isaacs and Henry Francis Finn wrote about him, they exaggerated the violence and minimized the brilliance. They needed him to be a monster so that British conquest could look like mercy. They called him the Black Caesar, the tyrant of the South, the butcher. But none of them could explain how one man, starting from nothing, built a centralized state powerful enough to frighten empires. Their solution: demonize him. But look closer, even their lies reveal truth. They admitted his armies moved faster than European troops could track, that his communication network, using runners across hundreds of kilometers, was flawless, that his soldiers were trained to anticipate orders without words, using rhythm, formation, and sound. This wasn't barbarism. This was systemized brilliance, forged from hardship. He wasn't lucky. He wasn't insane. He was strategic. He unified scattered clans who spoke the same tongue but fought each other endlessly. He turned that chaos into cohesion. He transformed war from an endless cycle of raids into a state tool, a machine that produced unity, loyalty, and discipline. It's what every empire in history has done: Rome, Britain, America. But when Africa did it, it became taboo to mention. And that's the hidden legacy the world doesn't want to face. Shaka wasn't just ahead of his time. He was out of category. You can't fit him into the boxes of tribal chief or warlord. He was a state builder, a strategist, and a psychologist, a man who weaponized order in a world that only understood chaos. His death, orchestrated by his half-brothers Dingain and Melangana, wasn't just political murder. It was a reset. They thought by killing him, they could calm the storm. Instead, they unleashed it. The empire didn't vanish. It fragmented, carrying his methods across southern Africa. Generals trained under him became leaders in other regions, spreading his system like wildfire. By the time European settlers expanded deeper into the continent decades later, they weren't facing scattered tribes. They were facing militarized nations built on Shakan principles. That's why colonial expansion into southern Africa was slower, bloodier, more difficult than anywhere else. His ghost was in every formation, every ambush, every uprising. Even now, South Africa's military traditions carry his imprint. The Zulu regiments that fought in World Wars the Poems and II marched under his legacy. The patterns of discipline and pride, the synchronized chants, the iron respect for hierarchy, all born from his system. Shaka built not just soldiers, but psychological infrastructure. So when you hear his name, forget the colonial myths, forget the show. Remember the mind that turned spears into a science, chaos into order, and fear into empire. That's Shaka Zulu, the man they feared to teach you about, because once you understand him, you start to see that Africa's story was never one of weakness. It was one of interrupted power, because that's the war still being fought today. Not with spears or rifles, but with narratives. The same empires that once called Shaka a savage now sell his image on t-shirts and streaming platforms, sanitized and stripped of meaning. The same nations that invaded Africa now teach his story in their textbooks, but never his strategy, never the part that shows he outthought them. It's historical laundering, and it's deliberate. The truth is, if students learned how Shaka actually operated, how he used speed, intelligence, logistics, and psychology to dismantle enemies far larger than him, they'd start asking dangerous questions. They'd start seeing through the myth that Africa was primitive. They'd realize that the techniques modern armies use today, rapid mobility, encirclement tactics, morale warfare, all had an African blueprint, centuries before Europe industrialized them. Western historians often say Napoleon revolutionized warfare, but Shaka did what Napoleon did, with no cannons, no horses, no written manuals, just raw vision. He turned discipline into a culture and innovation into instinct. His MP formations anticipated blitzkrieg by over 100 years. That's not coincidence. That's genius. The world refuses to credit, and that's why, when colonial writers like Nathaniel Isaacs and Henry Francis Finn wrote about him, they exaggerated the violence and minimized the brilliance. They needed him to be a monster, so that British conquest could look like mercy. They called him the Black Caesar, the tyrant of the South, the butcher, but none of them could explain how one man, starting from nothing, built a centralized state, powerful enough to frighten empires. Their solution? Demonize him. But look closer. Even their lies reveal truth. They admitted his armies moved faster than European troops could track, that his communication network, using runners across hundreds of kilometers, was flawless, that his soldiers were trained to anticipate orders without words, using rhythm, formation, and sound. This wasn't barbarism. This was systemized brilliance, forged from hardship. He wasn't lucky. He wasn't insane. He was strategic. He unified scattered clans who spoke the same tongue but fought each other endlessly. He turned that chaos into cohesion. He transformed war from an endless cycle of raids into a state tool, a machine that produced unity, loyalty, and discipline. It's what every empire in history has done: Rome, Britain, America. But when Africa did it, it became taboo to mention. And that's the hidden legacy the world doesn't want to face. Shaka wasn't just ahead of his time, he was out of category. You can't fit him into the boxes of tribal chief or warlord. He was a state builder, a strategist, and a psychologist, a man who weaponized order in a world that only understood chaos. His death, orchestrated by his half-brothers Dingain and Milangana, wasn't just political murder, it was a reset. They thought by killing him, they could calm the storm. Instead, they unleashed it. The empire didn't vanish. It fragmented, carrying his methods across southern Africa. Generals trained under him became leaders in other regions, spreading his system like wildfire. By the time European settlers expanded deeper into the continent, decades later, they weren't facing scattered tribes. They were facing militarized nations, built on Shakan principles. That's why colonial expansion into southern Africa was slower, bloodier, more difficult than anywhere else. His ghost was in every formation, every ambush, every uprising. Even now, South Africa's military traditions carry his imprint. The Zulu regiments that fought in World Wars I and II marched under his legacy. The patterns of discipline and pride, the synchronized chants, the iron respect for hierarchy, all born from his system. Shaka built not just soldiers, but psychological infrastructure. So when you hear his name, forget the colonial myths, forget the show. Remember the mind that turns spears into a science, chaos into order, and fear into empire. That's Shaka Zulu, the man they feared to teach you about, because once you understand him, you start to see that Africa's story was never one of weakness. It was one of interrupted power, and let's be real, the interruption wasn't an accident. The moment Shaka proved what African organization could do, the world powers moved to suppress it. Britain, the Dutch, the Boers, they all saw what was coming. A united, militarized, modern-thinking Africa was their nightmare. Because how do you colonize people who already mastered logistics, communication, and discipline? You don't. You divide them first. You rewrite their story second. After Shaka's assassination in 1828, the European observers didn't breathe relief. They breathed opportunity. Reports started circulating fast, painting him as a bloodthirsty madman. Writers in London described him as possessed by demons. They wrote that his armies destroyed all before them, conveniently leaving out that every European empire did the same on a larger scale. The narrative was flipped. The colonizers became civilizers, and the empire builder became the villain. But Shaka's empire didn't fall overnight. The Zulu state remained powerful for decades, and when the British finally clashed with them at Isandlwana in 1879, they got the reminder of their lives. That day, the Zulus, descendants of Shaka's impis, annihilated a British force armed with rifles and artillery. Over 1,000 British soldiers gone in hours. The shock back in London was so deep that newspapers called it a massacre. They couldn't believe African warriors, barefoot and disciplined, had defeated the most powerful army on earth. What they didn't understand was that they weren't fighting savages. They were fighting the echo of Shaka, the systems he built, the pride he planted, the belief that no man, no empire, could dictate an African's destiny. That's why the British came back with vengeance. They regrouped, burned villages, and unleashed scorched earth tactics. They didn't just want to win, they wanted to erase the idea that Africa could ever win again. And that's the pattern: erase the proof, then control the perception. Every European victory that followed came with propaganda. They'd photograph a single British officer shaking hands with a Zulu elder and caption it "Peace Restored," even when that peace meant occupation. They'd put African kings in their museums, strip them of regalia, and call it anthropology. The war moved from the battlefield to the mind. See, Shaka didn't just create a military empire, he created a memory, a dangerous one, because memory breeds pride, and pride breeds unity. So colonial education had to twist that memory. They told future generations that Shaka's reign was a reign of terror, that Africans needed saving from their own leaders. They took his innovations, like regimental organization and advanced tactics, and pretended Europe invented them. Even in the modern era, the distortion continued. When Hollywood told Shaka's story, they gave you either the wild tyrant or the tragic hero, never the strategist. They showed his power, but not his purpose. They kept the blood, but cut the brilliance. Because the truth is, Shaka's story threatens the entire colonial timeline. It says Africa didn't need saving, it needed remembering. Think about it. When's the last time a movie showed Africa teaching anyone how to fight, how to organize, how to lead? They'll show Greece, Rome, China, but Africa, only in ruin. That's the trick. If they control the image, they control the imagination. But cracks are forming. South African historians, Zulu elders, and independent researchers are piecing the truth back together. They found that many of Shaka's so-called atrocities were fabricated by colonial writers who weren't even in Zululand at the time. They exaggerated numbers, invented rituals, and mistranslated Zulu words to sound sinister. Buthwa, meaning initiation, was mistranslated as massacre. Zulu, meaning heaven or sky, was twisted to mean tribe. They didn't just steal land, they stole meaning. And yet, even after centuries of distortion, his name still carries power. Go to KwaZulu-Natal today and speak the word Shaka. You'll see it in people's faces: pride, defiance, memory, because he's more than history. He's proof. Proof that Africa had its generals, its statesmen, its geniuses. Proof that we weren't waiting for Europe to discover civilization. But here's the question nobody in power wants you to ask. If Shaka Zulu could build an empire that rivaled Europe's without ships, steel, or gunpowder, what could Africa have been without interruption? That's the question they never want answered, because it exposes the entire game. If Shaka could create unity and structure out of chaos, imagine what a continent of Shakas could have done. Imagine an Africa that industrialized on its own terms, one where gold and diamonds stayed in African hands, one where trade routes flowed into the continent instead of bleeding out of it. The European colonial project depended on that future never happening, so they made sure Shaka's legacy was buried, twisted, and turned into fear. After his death, the narrative became weaponized. Missionaries and explorers arrived preaching salvation while quietly collecting intelligence. They'd write reports calling Zulu governance tyrannical, claiming the people lived in terror, ignoring the fact that those same people stood ready to defend their land to the death. They painted African order as oppression and European domination as civilization. It was psychological warfare long before they called it that, because the empire didn't just need African land, it needed African minds. You can't enslave a proud people, you have to break them first. You have to make them believe their past was chaos, so they'll accept your order. You have to make them ashamed of their warriors, so they'll follow your kings. That's why Shaka became a cautionary tale in colonial classrooms, not an inspiration. Be civilized, they said, or you'll become like him. But let's flip it. Shaka wasn't chaos, he was clarity. He saw through the disunity that had left southern Africa vulnerable. Before him, clans fought for cattle, land, and pride, weakening each other while outsiders watched. Shaka's genius wasn't just military, it was psychological. He replaced tribal identity with national identity. He taught people that the Zulu were not a clan, they were a nation. That was revolutionary. It terrified both neighbors and Europeans because it meant Africans could think collectively. Under his leadership, small skirmishes became strategic campaigns, local warriors became professional soldiers, villages became provinces, tribute became taxation. He took Africa's oldest traditions, discipline, kinship, honor, and turned them into state machinery. That's not savagery, that's governance. That's how empires are built. And what's wild, the very same Europeans who later colonized Africa were studying Shaka's systems. British officers in the 1840s wrote classified reports about Zulu organizational precision. They wanted to understand how barefoot men could coordinate large-scale maneuvers faster than trained regiments. They dissected his communication methods, his encirclement strategies, even his logistics, how he kept thousands fed, armed, and mobile. They didn't see a savage, they saw a threat. Because Shaka did what Europe had always feared, he proved that African intellect was not only equal but superior when unchained. His reforms were decades ahead of their time. He created military districts that mirrored modern command zones. He built supply systems based on redistribution instead of hoarding. He created a meritocracy, promotion through performance, not birthright. He turned sons of farmers into generals and gave the poor a path to power. That alone upended centuries of African hierarchy. And maybe that's why even some Africans feared him. Change at that scale always divides people. Some chiefs resisted his authority, some feared his strict discipline. But when you're uniting fractured nations, resistance is the price of progress. The same leaders who called him ruthless benefited from his protection when rival kingdoms tried to invade. The peace they enjoyed was built on the spine of his vision. What makes Shaka's story sting even more is what came after. The colonial powers that later carved up Africa in the Berlin Conference used his example as propaganda. See, they said, Africans need supervision. They took one man's quest for sovereignty and twisted it into proof that Africa couldn't handle freedom. That lie became the foundation for a century of colonization. But here's what they don't say. Europe learned from him. The British copied his regimental structure when building colonial militias. The Boers adopted his rapid assault formations in frontier wars. The French used Zulu war dances as a case study in morale building. They mocked his savagery publicly, but studied it privately. That's the mark of fear disguised as superiority. And still, despite all the manipulation, the truth survived, whispered in songs, carried in oral history, passed from elder to child. Shaka Senzangahona, the son of Senzangahona, became a symbol, not of conquest, but of self-determination. His story was proof that Africa could organize, strategize, and modernize without European direction. Today, historians are finally catching up. They're uncovering letters, maps, and missionary records that reveal how meticulously Shaka planned every campaign. They show how his so-called massacres were often defensive responses to invasions. They reveal how his empire's population was far higher than colonial reports claimed, meaning his people thrived under his rule, not perished. And when you strip away the colonial filter, you see something they never wanted you to. Shaka's genius was not in how he killed, it was in how he connected. He understood human behavior. He used rhythm and ceremony to unify armies. He weaponized emotion, loyalty, pride, fear, as effectively as he used steel. He mastered the one battlefield every empire still fights on today, the mind. So ask yourself, if one man with no formal education could invent a system so powerful it shook empires, what else did they hide from us? What other geniuses were buried under the label savage? What other African empires were reduced to footnotes because their brilliance embarrassed the colonizers? Because Shaka's story isn't just about war, it's about what happens when black excellence becomes undeniable. And that's exactly why they tried to erase it. Shaka's influence didn't vanish when the colonial powers drew lines on maps. It evolved, quietly, like a current under the surface. The same principles he built into the Zulu army, discipline, mobility, psychological mastery, became the blueprint for resistance across southern Africa. Communities that once whispered his name in fear now carried it in pride, understanding that unity was the weapon the colonizers feared most. Every time Europe tried to write Africa as weak, Shaka's systems proved otherwise. His regiments didn't just fight, they performed dominance, teaching the colonized and colonizer alike that strategy comes from organization, not guns alone. His methods infiltrated warfare beyond Zululand, influencing uprisings, guerrilla tactics, and even early nationalist movements. Freedom fighters didn't know it, but they were walking in his footsteps. The Boers, the British, and later the apartheid regime all understood the danger. They realized that African cohesion, the kind Shaka engineered, could not be tolerated. That's why they demonized him, why they exaggerated his brutality, why textbooks painted him as a cautionary tale. Fear of his organizational genius ran deeper than fear of his armies, because Shaka didn't just control men, he controlled minds, and minds once liberated are impossible to enslave. Think about it, when historians talk about Napoleon, Caesar, or Alexander, they focus on strategy, innovation, and psychological manipulation. But Shaka, they call him mad. They show the blood, ignore the brilliance, and teach the world that Africans were followers, not architects. That's not oversight, that's intentional erasure. They couldn't teach the truth without threatening the narrative of European supremacy. Even after his assassination, his empire didn't simply disappear. Dingain and Mpande tried to reign in his legacy, but the systems he built were too ingrained. His army, his logistics, his discipline, all survived in fragments. When the British advanced in the late 19th century, they encountered a society already trained to resist. At Asandalwana, the Zulu army crushed the British not because they had better weapons, they didn't, but because they had Shaka's method. Coordination, timing, morale, encirclement. Europe had underestimated the depth of African intellect for centuries, and they learned it the hard way. Colonial powers adapted, but only partially. They could study his tactics, copy his formations, and implement his logistical thinking, but they couldn't replicate his vision for African unity. that remained a threat. Every textbook, newspaper, and missionary account twisted his story to make it look like failure, madness, or cruelty. Anything but brilliance. They created a caricature to hide the pattern. Because if Africa ever remembered Shaka as he truly was, a thinker, strategist, and nation builder, the entire foundation of colonial ideology would collapse. The psychological dimension of his legacy is even more profound. Shaka didn't just fight battles on the ground, he fought in the minds of his people. He understood that morale is a weapon. Rituals, drills, and regalia weren't just for show. They reinforced identity, loyalty, and purpose. Warriors didn't need orders shouted across fields. They moved in sync because they believed in the empire, in the king, and ultimately, in themselves. That's genius disguised as tradition. That's leadership disguised as fear. And yet, despite centuries of distortion, his influence persists. Modern African militaries, freedom movements, and community organizations unknowingly draw from his principles. He taught that discipline can coexist with humanity, that power can protect instead of exploit, and that structure can liberate rather than oppress. He showed that an empire doesn't require domination over others, only cohesion among your own. But the world didn't want this story to survive, so they buried it, dressed it in fiction, and sold it back to us as myth. Hollywood painted him as a tyrant for entertainment. Colonial historians labeled him a butcher for political convenience. Missionaries erased his achievements for moral control. And yet, no matter how deep they buried him, the pattern remained. His strategies, principles, and vision spread underground, carried in memory, song, and practice. This is the lesson most people miss. Shaka's genius wasn't just in his army. It was in his understanding of people, psychology, and society. He built systems that allowed a fragmented population to function as one. He created an empire not just to fight, but to survive, to teach, and to endure. That's why his methods could echo for decades after his death. That's why, even under colonial rule, his legacy shaped resistance. So ask yourself, if one man, with no written manuals, no industry, and no allies outside his borders, could build an empire that rivaled Europe, what else have they hidden from you? What other African geniuses, inventors, and leaders were erased to maintain a lie? Shaka's story is the proof that the African mind has always been capable of brilliance, and the world has spent centuries trying to convince you otherwise. The question isn't whether Shaka was brilliant, it's whether we are ready to reclaim that brilliance for ourselves. Because the moment we do, the narrative shifts. The moment we see him as he truly was, everything Europe told us about African weakness begins to crumble. The same systems that built the Zulu Empire can inspire unity, strategy, and power in our own communities today. And here's the cliffhanger they never wanted you to consider. If Shaka's model of leadership, discipline, and psychological mastery could unite a fragmented region against empires, what happens when an entire continent remembers it, applies it, and refuses to be divided again? Shaka didn't just fight battles, he engineered them. Every spear, every shield, every regiment had a purpose. The battlefield was his canvas, and he painted with movement, timing, and fear. The horns of the bull formation wasn't just clever, it was genius. The chest to engage, the horns to flank, the loins to reinforce. A living machine that turned thousands into one. Europe laughed when they first saw it. They didn't laugh for long. His innovations went beyond tactics. He redefined logistics, feeding armies across vast territories, moving supplies with precision, and using intelligence networks to anticipate enemy moves. No European general of the time had to deal with terrain, climate, and logistics like he did. Yet he mastered all three. That's why, when the British and Boers finally faced the Zulu in open battle, they were shocked. Not by bravery alone, but by calculation, speed, and cohesion. Shaka had already rewritten what war could be, and the genius wasn't limited to combat. Shaka transformed society itself. He turned scattered clans into a single nation. He imposed discipline, but not without purpose. Warriors had paths to leadership, families had protection, and the people understood the stakes of unity. He weaponized identity. If Europeans wanted to conquer, they needed Africa divided. Shaka made that impossible. His strategy extended beyond the battlefield into the minds of his people. That's why his image terrified colonial powers. They didn't fear his death, they feared his influence. That's why colonial historians exaggerated his cruelty, minimized his achievements, and created the narrative of the mad tyrant. They needed to erase the truth that African innovation, organization, and strategy existed long before European armies arrived. They feared it would inspire resistance, and it did. Even after his assassination, Shaka's systems persisted. His army structures influenced future generations, his governance principles guided leaders, and his psychological tactics informed resistance movements. Izanwana in 1879 was a testament to that. Decades after his death, Zulu warriors annihilated a modern British force. Guns and cannons failed against discipline, coordination, and morale, all Shaka legacies. Yet the world barely remembers that. Europe rewrote it as luck, as a fluke, as anomaly. The narrative had to diminish his genius, because acknowledging Shaka as a strategist and visionary would undermine centuries of colonial propaganda. That's the power of erasure. To make brilliance look like madness, to turn a master tactician into a storybook villain. But the truth survived. Through oral histories, songs, and traditions, the spirit of Shaka endured. African communities carried his lessons in rhythm, chant, and ceremony. His psychological mastery, the unity, the pride, the discipline, transcended military application. It became culture, it became identity, it became resistance. That's why modern movements, unknowingly, follow his blueprint. Guerrilla fighters, freedom fighters, and political organizers use tactics reminiscent of Shaka's principles. Small units, mobility, psychological leverage, and unity under a vision. Leadership, he showed, isn't about fear, it's about structure, identity, and purpose. He weaponized human potential long before modern armies theorized it. And yet they still call him savage. They still reduce his story to blood and terror. But those who look closer see the pattern. Discipline beats chaos, unity beats division, knowledge beats ignorance. That's Shaka's real legacy, showing that African minds were never inferior, just interrupted. So here's the question: if one man could build an empire, create a nation, and leave a legacy that echoed centuries beyond his life, what else have they hidden from us? What other African geniuses were erased to maintain the illusion that civilization was a European gift? Because the moment we truly remember Shaka, not the villain they sold us, not the caricature they televised, but the strategist, the nation builder, the mind behind the movement, everything they taught us about African history starts to fall apart. And when history falls apart, power shifts. So the real question isn't about his spears or his victories, it's about us. What happens when a people reclaim the genius that was never theirs to lose? Shaka's brilliance wasn't in brute force, it was in foresight. He didn't just react to enemies, he anticipated them. Every move he made considered terrain, morale, timing, and enemy psychology. He knew fear could be harnessed, pride could be weaponized, and loyalty could be engineered. That's why his impetus moved like living organisms, synchronized, deadly, unstoppable. Europe had never seen war fought with that level of precision, and they feared it. But let's be clear, Shaka's genius wasn't only for conquest, he used it to protect his people. He knew that fragmented clans were vulnerable, that disunity invited invasion. So he unified, disciplined, and centralized. He created a state where allegiance wasn't optional, but participation built pride. He didn't just make soldiers, he created citizens of a vision. And that's what terrified the colonizers. A people who could think collectively, organize strategically, and defend themselves without outside help. The British and Boers tried to rewrite the story immediately after his death. They called him a tyrant, a madman, a butcher. Missionaries and travelers exaggerated massacres while ignoring defensive campaigns, political strategy, and social reform. In their textbooks, Shaka was a cautionary tale, a justification for colonial rule. But in reality, he had created a model state, a functional society that European armies envied. And the irony, the same armies studied his methods in secret to adapt them for their own use. His military innovations were revolutionary. The short stabbing spear, the large cowhide shield, and the disciplined formations weren't random. They allowed close combat efficiency, psychological dominance, and rapid maneuverability. The horns of the bull encirclement tactic wasn't just clever, it was a mind game. Enemies thought they could escape, but Shaka controlled perception. Every move, every sound, every rhythm of the impi was designed to manipulate the battlefield before the first blow was struck. And the psychological component didn't end with the enemy. Shaka molded his soldiers' minds as rigorously as their bodies. Initiations, drills, songs, and ceremonies weren't just tradition, they reinforced loyalty, fearlessness, and identity. He created a system where the army believed in itself more than any external force could threaten it. That's leadership beyond instinct. That's engineering human behavior. Even after Shaka's death, his systems persisted. His regiments, strategies, and administrative reforms influenced the Zulu kingdom for decades. When the British faced Zulu forces at Isandlwana in 1879, it wasn't luck that led to the massacre of over 1,000 British troops. It was the continuation of Shaka's organizational genius. The empire's cohesion, its communication, and its strategy were still very much alive, a testament to his enduring influence. Colonial powers tried to erase his brilliance, but they couldn't erase the lessons embedded in culture. Oral histories, songs, and local traditions preserved the truth. Communities remembered him not as a madman, but as a visionary who transformed chaos into order, fear into loyalty, and fragmented clans into a powerful nation. That memory survived even when textbooks lied. And this isn't just ancient history. Shaka's principles still echo today. Freedom movements, guerrilla tactics, and even organizational strategies in Africa, in the diaspora, unknowingly reflect his legacy. Small mobile units, psychological leverage, collective purpose, leadership built on discipline and vision. The blueprint he created centuries ago continues to inspire resistance, strategy, and empowerment. But the world still prefers to see Shaka as a cautionary tale. Hollywood films, colonial accounts, and missionary writings emphasize blood and terror while ignoring intelligence, strategy, and governance. They sanitize fear while erasing brilliance. And yet, anyone who studies the patterns sees it. Shaka wasn't just a warrior, he was a revolutionary mind, the architect of modern African military and statecraft. So the real question becomes, if one man, with no industry, no formal training, and no outside allies, could build a nation and a system that rivaled empires, what other truths have been buried? What other African leaders, inventors, and thinkers were erased to maintain the lie of European superiority? Because understanding Shaka's legacy isn't just about honoring a historical figure. It's about recognizing a pattern. African intellect has always been present, organized, and capable of greatness. The world tried to hide it, but it cannot be hidden forever. And once we see Shaka Zulu for what he truly was, strategist, visionary, nation builder, the story of Africa and of black excellence begins to reclaim itself. So here's the cliffhanger they never wanted you to ask. If Shaka's vision could unite clans and repel empires, what happens when an entire continent remembers it, applies it, and refuses to be divided again? Shaka's story doesn't just end with battles and tactics. His genius extended into the very soul of leadership. He understood fear, loyalty, and ambition in ways most rulers only read about centuries later. He wasn't just fighting enemies on the battlefield. He was shaping the behavior of his people, engineering their loyalty, and crafting a nation that functioned as a single organism. That's the power that history textbooks deliberately skip over. Look at his army. It wasn't a loose collection of warriors. It was a disciplined machine. Each empire operated with a precise rhythm, moving in coordination across miles of terrain, responding instantly to commands without confusion. The short stabbing spear, the large cowhide shield, the chest, horns, and loins formation, all of it was designed to optimize efficiency, shock the enemy, and manipulate perception. This wasn't random brutality. It was systemized warfare, centuries ahead of its time. And Shaka's impact didn't stop at war. He restructured society itself. He unified scattered clans into a single nation, imposing order while simultaneously giving people purpose. He created systems of promotion based on merit, not birth, meaning that leadership was accessible to those who proved themselves. He understood that loyalty was born from respect, opportunity, and pride, not fear alone. By centralizing authority and instilling discipline, he transformed survival into strategy. He built more than an army. He built a state. Colonial powers quickly recognized the danger. Britain, the Boers, and later other European interests understood that a united African nation was a threat to their expansionist ambitions. That's why they went to such lengths to demonize him. Nathaniel Isaacs, Henry Finn, and countless other colonial writers exaggerated atrocities, minimized intelligence and strategy, and recast Shaka as a tyrant and a butcher. But look closely. In the same pages where they vilified him, they admitted his armies moved faster than theirs, anticipated attacks before they happened, and maintained logistics over hundreds of kilometers. They hated him because he was too competent. Even after his assassination, the empire's structures persisted. Tingane and Mimponde couldn't dismantle what Shaka had built. The Zulu army maintained discipline, morale, and cohesion, proving that his influence was systemic, not just personal. Decades later, at the Battle of Isandlwana, the British army, armed with modern rifles and artillery, was crushed by Zulu forces. The result wasn't luck. It was the continuation of Shaka's blueprint: psychological warfare, coordinated attacks, and unwavering discipline. Europe had underestimated African ingenuity for centuries, and Shaka's strategies proved that African military thought was sophisticated, deliberate, and innovative. Psychologically, Shaka was a master. He didn't just fight with weapons, he fought with perception. He knew how to inspire courage in his warriors and fear in his enemies. Drills, ceremonies, and chants weren't merely ritual. They were tools to mold minds. Loyalty became instinct, discipline became identity, and morale became as powerful as the sharpest spear. This understanding of human behavior is what separates a good general from a visionary. Colonial powers knew they couldn't outsmart this on their own, which is why they twisted the narrative. By labeling Shaka mad or savage, they sought to delegitimize not just him, but the idea that Africans could organize, strategize, and innovate independently. They wanted the world to see Africa as weak, chaotic, and in need of European guidance, and yet secretly, they studied him. British officers, Boers, and even missionaries documented his formations, logistics, and tactics to replicate them. They feared him publicly and learned from him privately. Shaka's legacy survived because it wasn't just in armies or maps, it was cultural. Oral histories, songs, and local traditions carried his lessons forward. His psychological techniques, his vision of unity, and his methods of discipline became embedded in Zulu culture. Even under colonial oppression, the memory of Shaka informed resistance movements, guerrilla strategies, and leadership principles. Freedom fighters across southern Africa unknowingly applied his blueprint: small mobile units, coordinated attacks, psychological leverage, and strong internal cohesion. His mind lived on in every calculated maneuver, every disciplined formation, and every act of resistance. And that's the part history doesn't want you to see. Shaka's story is a blueprint, for reclaiming power. It shows that African minds were never lacking in strategy, foresight, or innovation. Europe didn't create civilization, they interrupted it. Shaka proves that African nations could organize, defend, and thrive long before colonizers arrived. And the fact that this is being rediscovered now, that historians are correcting exaggerations and lies, shows just how dangerous the truth really is. So ask yourself, if one man could unite clans, create a disciplined state, and outthink empires with nothing but vision, skill, and will, what other African geniuses have been buried under centuries of lies? How many leaders, inventors, strategists, and visionaries were erased to maintain the illusion of European superiority? Shaka's story is not just about a man, it's about a pattern, a blueprint of excellence and resilience that colonial powers spent centuries trying to erase. And here's the cliffhanger they never wanted you to ask. If Shaka's methods could build an empire that resisted the most powerful nations of the 19th century, what happens when that knowledge is reclaimed, studied, and applied across the African diaspora today? What happens when we remember that brilliance isn't borrowed, it's our birthright? Shaka's story is more than battles and military genius. It's about power, not just the power to conquer, but the power to shape minds, societies, and futures. He understood something that European powers never admitted: control the people, and you control the land. But true control comes not from fear alone, and that's why he's still misunderstood. He fused discipline with purpose, loyalty with identity, and strategy with psychology. That's why his empire functioned like a living organism. Every regiment, every spear, every chant had intent, and intent is harder to break than steel. Even his enemies noticed it. Missionaries, traders, and colonial observers who came to demonize him were forced to admit the truth in private journals. They marveled at the organization, the efficiency, the foresight. One officer wrote, "These men act as one, yet each knows exactly what to do without orders." Europe had never seen that before. They laughed publicly, calling him mad. Privately, they studied his formations, memorized his logistics, and copied what they could. Fear disguised as contempt. Shaka didn't just revolutionize warfare, he redefined what it meant to be African. Before him, the southern region was a patchwork of clans constantly at war. He unified them under a shared identity, Zulu. He replaced petty rivalries with a sense of national purpose. That wasn't just political savvy, that was psychological engineering. He taught people that loyalty and discipline could create power greater than the sum of its parts. That lesson alone terrified Europe, because they didn't just want land, they wanted submission. Shaka showed that land cannot be conquered without first conquering the mind, and he refused. And the brilliance didn't stop there. His army wasn't just strong, it was efficient. He introduced standardized weapons, trained soldiers in formations that could adapt on the fly, and organized supply lines across hundreds of kilometers. Intelligence and reconnaissance were integrated into every campaign. No European general of the time could match that combination of speed, discipline, and foresight. Shaka's imps weren't just soldiers, they were coordinated instruments of strategy, rhythm, and timing. When Shaka died, the European narrative didn't pause. They immediately twisted his story, portraying him as a cruel tyrant. Missionary accounts exaggerated violence, colonial texts minimized innovation, and popular histories turned him into a footnote in civilized history. But in reality, Shaka's legacy survived. His organizational genius remained in the army, his societal reforms persisted in governance, and his psychological principles influenced generations. Decades later, Zulu forces would annihilate British troops at Isandlwana, a victory built entirely on Shaka's blueprint. Colonial powers understood that they couldn't replicate his vision, they could only attempt to mimic his tactics. They copied formations, studied logistics, and analyzed morale techniques, but they couldn't unify people under a shared sense of purpose the way he did. That's the difference between replication and genius. They could steal his methods, but they could not steal his vision. Shaka's psychological mastery is often overlooked. Initiation ceremonies, drills, and rituals weren't mere tradition. They were tools to forge loyalty, courage, and identity. Every soldier internalized purpose and pride. Fear of failure, respect for the king, and cohesion with fellow warriors became instinct. That's not tyranny, that's engineering human potential. He weaponized morale long before modern armies theorized it, and he built a culture that made the Zulu army almost unstoppable. Even today, his influence is everywhere. Freedom movements, guerrilla tactics, and leadership principles across Africa and the diaspora echo his systems. Small mobile units, coordinated strikes, and psychological leverage all reflect Shaka's methodology. His genius wasn't bound to his lifetime, it became cultural DNA, and the fact that it persisted, despite colonial suppression, is proof of how resilient African innovation truly is. The story isn't just about Shaka Zulu as a man, it's about what his genius exposes. Africa was never primitive, disorganized, or helpless. Shaka's empire, his strategies, and his societal vision demonstrate that African minds had mastered governance, warfare, and psychological influence long before colonial intervention. The lie of European superiority depends on erasing him, misrepresenting him, and turning his brilliance into caricature. So here's the question they never wanted you to ask. If one man could unify clans, transform society, and defeat empires with nothing but intellect, discipline, and vision, what else have they buried? How many African leaders, inventors, and strategists have been erased to maintain the myth of European dominance? And more importantly, what happens when we reclaim those lessons today? Because Shaka's legacy is more than history. It's a blueprint, a pattern, a demonstration of African ingenuity, resilience, and vision. And the moment we truly understand it, the moment we see the genius they tried to erase, the narrative of Africa and of black excellence begins to shift. And here's the cliffhanger they feared. If one man could create an empire that rivaled European powers, what happens when an entire continent remembers his strategies, applies his vision, and refuses to be divided again? The question isn't whether Shaka was brilliant, it's whether we are ready to reclaim that brilliance as our own. Shaka's life teaches a lesson that goes beyond history books and battlefields. True power is as much psychological as it is physical. He understood that wars aren't just won with spears and shields. They're won in the minds of the people you lead and the enemies you face. He built systems that made loyalty instinctual, courage habitual, and strategy a second nature. That's why his armies moved with machine-like precision, why they could encircle enemies before the first scream, and why even the most seasoned European officers were forced to take notes in secret. He didn't just innovate weapons, he innovated organization. Regiments were structured for efficiency, supply lines for sustainability, and communication for speed. Each soldier knew not only what to do, but why. Every formation, every chant, every ritual was designed to reinforce unity and purpose. This wasn't chaos. This was order on a scale that Europe had never seen in sub-Saharan Africa. They called him mad, but the truth is Shaka was decades ahead of his time in military science and societal engineering. And yet, the colonial narrative works hard to erase that brilliance. Missionaries, travelers, and colonial historians exaggerated the violence of his campaigns, framing him as a tyrant to justify European interference. They minimized his strategic genius, erased his societal reforms, and replaced his vision with caricature. The truth was inconvenient. A single African leader had built a disciplined, unified, and thriving nation, a blueprint that directly contradicted European propaganda about African inferiority. Even after his death, his systems endured. Dingain and Mpande may have ruled in his stead, but they relied on structures Shaka had created. His army's cohesion, his logistical networks, and his psychological strategies persisted, and decades later, the British at Isandlwana faced a force shaped by his vision. Modern weaponry didn't compensate for discipline, coordination, and morale. Zulu warriors, guided by Shaka's principles, devastated a well-armed colonial army, a reminder that African ingenuity had never been inferior, only suppressed. Shaka's genius was also cultural. He fused military strategy with societal organization, showing that leadership extends beyond the battlefield. He unified fragmented clans into a single identity, instilling pride, purpose, and shared destiny. Meritocracy replaced inherited privilege in many military ranks, and the people saw tangible benefits from loyalty and performance. Discipline wasn't oppression, it was empowerment. Identity wasn't imposed, it was cultivated. And that, more than any weapon, was the secret to his lasting influence. Colonial powers understood the danger. They could copy formations and tactics, but they could never replicate the vision. They studied him secretly, mimicked what they could, but they feared the idea of African unity. That's why textbooks demonized him, while private reports praised his methods. That's why they labeled him insane, instead of acknowledging that he had mastered organization, psychology, and strategy. Europe had never faced a threat so intellectual, so systemic, and so enduring. Even today, his influence survives in subtle ways. Freedom fighters, community organizers, and resistance movements unknowingly draw on Shaka's principles: small mobile units, coordinated action, psychological leverage, and a strong shared identity. His methods outlasted colonial armies, oppressive regimes, and centuries of erasure. The lesson is clear: African intelligence has never been absent. It was hidden, distorted, and misrepresented, but it was never gone. And that's the part most people miss. Shaka's story isn't just about war, it's about what happens when brilliance is denied, fear is weaponized, and history is manipulated. It shows that African minds were never inferior, only interrupted. It proves that leadership, innovation, and strategy can emerge from any context, even under constant threat. Shaka wasn't just a warrior, he was a visionary architect of society, a master of psychology, and a teacher whose lessons endure beyond time. So here's the question that history doesn't want you to ask. If one man could unite a fragmented region, create a disciplined state, and outthink empires, what other African geniuses were erased to maintain the lie of European superiority? How many leaders, inventors, and visionaries were reduced to caricatures or footnotes? And what happens when we reclaim those lessons today, in our communities, our movements, and our identity? Because the story of Shaka Zulu isn't just about the past, it's a blueprint for the present. It's a map showing how discipline, unity, and strategy can transform chaos into power. It's proof that African intellect has always been capable of shaping the world. And it's a warning: the moment we remember, organize, and apply those principles, the narrative shifts, and the lie of inferiority begins to crumble. So ask yourself, if Shaka's methods could build an empire that rivaled European powers, what happens when an entire continent reclaims that vision, studies it, and refuses to be divided again? What happens when the blueprint of brilliance, hidden for centuries, is finally applied? Because the moment we embrace that legacy, we stop living in someone else's story, and we begin writing our own. Shaka didn't just fight battles, he rewrote the rules of war. He saw the battlefield, not as chaos but as a system: terrain, timing, morale, and perception, all accounted for. The short stabbing spear and large cowhide shield weren't inventions of brutality, they were tools of precision. His horns of the bull formation wasn't flair, it was a psychological trap: chest to engage, horns to encircle, loins to reinforce. Every regiment had a role, every movement had purpose. Europe had never seen coordination like this, and they feared it. But Shaka's genius went beyond tactics. He built society like an army. Clans were unified, loyalty was systematized, and merit replaced birthright in leadership ranks. Discipline was empowerment, not oppression. Identity was instilled, not forced. He taught his people that cohesion was strength, pride was armor, and strategy could outmatch raw firepower. That's what terrified colonial powers, a people who could think collectively, move decisively, and resist dominion. Colonial narratives tried to erase him. Missionaries, traders, and historians painted him as a tyrant, a madman, a savage. They highlighted supposed massacres, ignored societal reforms, and recast his brilliance as cruelty. But the truth was undeniable. His armies moved faster, coordinated better, and struck harder than any European force in southern Africa. They copied his tactics in secret, even as they denounced him publicly. Fear disguised as contempt. Even after his assassination, Shaka's structures survived. Dingain and Pandey couldn't dismantle his systems. Zulu regiments maintained discipline and strategy. At Isandlwana, in 1879, decades after Shaka's death, British forces equipped with rifles and artillery were crushed. It wasn't luck, it was the continuation of his blueprint: psychological mastery, logistical efficiency, and cohesive strategy. European arrogance failed against centuries of African ingenuity. Shaka's true weapon was psychological. Rituals, chants, and drills weren't decorative. They built loyalty, fearlessness, and instinctive cohesion. Soldiers internalized purpose. Morale became as deadly as the spear. He engineered behavior centuries before modern armies theorized it. His leadership created culture, identity, and resistance simultaneously. His genius was systemic, not accidental. Even today, Shaka's influence persists. Guerrilla tactics, freedom movements, and organizational strategies across Africa and the diaspora echo his principles: mobility, coordination, psychological leverage, and shared identity. His model proves African innovation survived colonization, hidden but unbroken. That's why Europe had to distort his story. Acknowledging him as brilliant threatened the narrative of African inferiority. The lesson is clear: Shaka's story isn't just military history. It's proof of African intellect, resilience, and organizational genius. One man, with no written manuals or industrial support, unified clans, created a disciplined state, and resisted empires. And yet they call him a tyrant. They call him mad. They erase his accomplishments. So here's the question they never wanted asked: if one man could build an empire, unite a people, and outthink European powers, what other African leaders, inventors, and strategists were buried under centuries of lies? How many geniuses have been erased to maintain the myth of European supremacy? And the final twist: Shaka's blueprint isn't lost. It's waiting to be remembered, studied, and applied. The systems he built, the strategies he used, and the identity he forged can still empower communities today. The moment we reclaim that knowledge, the narrative shifts. The moment we embrace his genius, the lie of African inferiority crumbles. Ask yourself, if one man could rewrite warfare, governance, and loyalty in southern Africa, what happens when a whole continent remembers it? What happens when the blueprint of brilliance is no longer buried, but alive in our hands? That's the question Shaka left for us, and it's still unanswered. Shaka Zulu's story isn't just about war, it's about mastery. He turned chaos into order, fear into loyalty, and fragmented clans into a nation. Every spear, shield, and formation had a purpose. His short stabbing spear and massive cowhide shield weren't weapons of brutality. They were instruments of precision. The horns of the bull formation wasn't decoration. It was a psychological trap. Chest to engage, horns to flank, loins to reinforce. Every soldier moved as part of a machine. Every enemy encounter was engineered. Europe had never seen anything like it, and they feared it. But Shaka's genius didn't stop at the battlefield. He transformed society itself. Clans became disciplined regiments. Loyalty became instinct. Merit determined leadership. Pride replaced fear. Identity became armor. He taught his people that unity was strength. Strategy could overcome force, and culture itself could be weaponized. That's what made European powers nervous, a people who could organize, adapt, and resist domination. Colonial narratives worked hard to erase him. Missionaries and historians labeled him a tyrant, a madman, a savage. They exaggerated violence, ignored reforms, and recast genius as cruelty. But their private journals told the truth. His armies moved faster, coordinated better, and struck harder than any European forces in southern Africa. They feared him publicly, copied his tactics secretly. That's history's cruel irony. Brilliance demonized, imitation hidden. Even after his assassination, Shaka's systems endured. Dingain and Mpande couldn't dismantle the structure he built. Regiments maintained cohesion, strategy persisted, and decades later, at Isandlwana, British forces equipped with rifles and artillery were annihilated. It wasn't luck. It was Shaka's blueprint, psychological warfare, disciplined formations, and logistical mastery. European arrogance failed against African ingenuity. Again, Shaka's real weapon was the mind. Drills, chants, and ceremonies built loyalty, courage, and instinctive cohesion. Soldiers internalized purpose. Morale became as deadly as the spear. He engineered behavior centuries before modern armies theorized it. Leadership became culture. Identity became strategy. Resistance became natural. That's Shaka's enduring genius. Systemic, unstoppable, transformative. His influence didn't die with him. Modern guerrilla tactics, freedom movements, and organizational strategies in Africa and the diaspora echo Shaka's principles: mobility, coordination, psychological leverage, and collective identity. Colonial powers distorted his story because acknowledging his brilliance threatened the myth of African inferiority. But the truth persisted, embedded in culture, memory, and resistance. Shaka's story proves that African intellect was never absent, only interrupted. One man, without industry or formal training, unified clans, created a disciplined state, and resisted empires. And yet history calls him a tyrant, erases his accomplishments, and diminishes his legacy. So here's the question they didn't want you to ask. If one man could rewrite warfare, governance, and society in southern Africa, what other African geniuses were erased to protect European myths of superiority? How many leaders, inventors, and strategists were buried under centuries of lies? And the ultimate twist, Shaka's blueprint is still here. His systems, strategies, and vision can still empower communities today. The moment we reclaim his knowledge, the narrative changes. The moment we embrace his genius, centuries of lies crumble. Ask yourself, if one man could unify a nation, outthink empires, and engineer loyalty and strategy, what happens when an entire continent remembers it? What happens when the brilliance they tried to bury is finally alive in our hands? That's the question Shaka left us, and it's still waiting for an answer. Shaka Zulu didn't just fight battles, he engineered them. Every formation, every movement, every regiment had a purpose. The short stabbing spear, the massive cowhide shield, the horns of the bull tactic. It wasn't chaos, it was precision. Chest to engage, horns to flank, loins to reinforce. Soldiers moved as a single organism. Enemies were manipulated before the first blow was struck. Europe had never seen anything like it. They feared it. But Shaka's genius went beyond the battlefield. He unified clans, instilled discipline, and built a society where loyalty, merit, and pride replaced fear. Leadership was earned, identity was reinforced, and cohesion became strength. He weaponized culture itself. European powers understood the threat. A people who could think collectively, act decisively, and resist domination. That's why they lied about him. Missionaries and colonial writers painted him as a madman, a tyrant, a savage. They exaggerated violence and minimized strategy. But private journals admitted it. His armies moved faster, coordinated better, and struck harder than European forces. Fear disguised as contempt. They copied his methods in secret, even as they demonized him publicly. Even after his assassination, Shaka's systems endured. Dingain and Mpande relied on the structures he built. Decades later, at Azindawana, Zulu forces annihilated British troops. It wasn't luck, it was Shaka's blueprint: psychological warfare, disciplined formations, and logistical mastery. European arrogance failed against African ingenuity. Shaka's real weapon was the mind. Rituals, drills, and chants created loyalty, courage, and cohesion. Morale became as deadly as the spear. He engineered behavior centuries before modern armies theorized it. Leadership became culture, identity became strategy, resistance became instinct. His influence persists today. Freedom fighters, guerrilla movements, and community organizers unknowingly use his principles: mobility, coordination, psychological leverage, and shared identity. Colonial powers distorted his story to maintain the myth of African inferiority, but culture and memory preserved his genius. Shaka's story proves African intellect was never absent, only erased. One man, without industry or foreign allies, unified clans, built a disciplined state, and resisted empires. Yet history calls him a tyrant and diminishes his legacy. Here's the question they buried: if one man could create such a system, how many other African leaders, inventors, and strategists were erased to protect European myths? How many truths were hidden to sell the lie of African inferiority? The twist: Shaka's blueprint is still alive. His strategies, his governance, and his vision can still empower today. The moment we reclaim that knowledge, centuries of lies crumble. So ask yourself, if Shaka's methods could unify a nation and defeat empires, what happens when an entire continent remembers and applies that genius? What happens when brilliance they tried to bury is finally wielded by the people it belongs to? The question Shaka left us is still unanswered. Shaka Zulu's legacy isn't just history. It's a lesson in power. He didn't just wield weapons. He wielded strategy, psychology, and culture. His battlefield wasn't random chaos. It was a living system. Each regiment moved with precision. Each formation was calculated, and each attack manipulated perception. The short stabbing spear and cowhide shield weren't tools of brutality. They were instruments of dominance. Horns of the bull tactic wasn't flair. It was a trap: chest to engage, horns to encircle, loins to reinforce. Every soldier knew their role. Every enemy move was anticipated. Europe had never seen that, and they feared it. But Shaka's genius extended beyond warfare. He unified clans, disciplined society, and created a state where loyalty, pride, and merit replaced fear. Leadership was earned, cohesion was reinforced, and identity became a weapon. He didn't just lead an army, he forged a nation. That's what scared colonial powers: a people capable of collective thought, rapid action, and sustained resistance. Colonial narratives twisted his story immediately. Missionaries and historians labeled him a tyrant, a madman, a monster. Violence was exaggerated, strategy minimized, and his brilliance reduced to caricature. Yet their private writings told the truth. His armies moved faster, coordinated better, and struck harder than any European force in southern Africa. They feared him publicly, copied him privately. That's history's irony: genius demonized, imitation hidden. Even after his assassination, Shaka's structures survived. Dingain and Mpande relied on them. The Zulu army retained discipline, organization, and strategic precision. Decades later, at Isandawana, British forces with rifles and artillery were annihilated. It wasn't luck. It was Shaka's blueprint: psychological mastery, logistical efficiency, and coordinated tactics. European arrogance failed against African ingenuity. Psychology was Shaka's secret weapon. Drills, rituals, and chants were designed to instill courage, loyalty, and instinctive cohesion. Soldiers internalized purpose. Morale became as lethal as the spear. Leadership became culture. Identity became strategy. Resistance became instinct. Shaka engineered behavior long before modern militaries. understood it. His influence persists today. Guerrilla tactics, freedom movements, and organizational strategies across Africa and the diaspora echo his principles: mobility, coordination, psychological leverage, and shared identity. Colonial powers distorted his story because acknowledging his genius threatened the myth of African inferiority. But oral histories, songs, and traditions preserved his methods. Shaka proves that African intellect was never absent, only erased. One man, with no industrial support or foreign allies, unified clans, built a disciplined state, and resisted empires. And yet history calls him a tyrant and diminishes his legacy. So here's the question they don't want asked. If one man could create such a system, how many other African geniuses were buried to protect European myths? How many truths were hidden to sell the lie of African inferiority? The twist: Shaka's blueprint isn't gone. His systems, strategies, and vision can still empower communities today. The moment we reclaim that knowledge, the narrative changes, lies crumble, brilliance is restored. Ask yourself, if Shaka could unify a nation, outthink empires, and engineer loyalty and strategy, what happens when an entire continent remembers it? What happens when the brilliance they tried to bury is finally wielded by the people it belongs to? The question Shaka left us remains, and it's still waiting for an answer. Shaka Zulu's story doesn't just end with history books, it ends with us. He was a man who saw power, not as violence alone, but as vision, psychology, and unity. He taught that discipline, identity, and loyalty could be engineered to build a nation, and that a people who move as one can resist even the most advanced armies. He wasn't just a warrior, he was a strategist, a societal architect, and a master of the human mind. And that's why Europe feared him, lied about him, and tried to erase him. But the truth survives. It lives in oral histories, in the Zulu culture, in every story of resistance across Africa and the diaspora. His methods, coordination, morale, mobility, psychological leverage, are still relevant, still powerful. Every time a community organizes, every time people reclaim their voice and heritage, Shaka's blueprint is at work. That's why colonial powers worked so hard to misrepresent him. A people who remember their own genius cannot be controlled. Shaka's life is proof that brilliance has always existed in Africa. He unified clans, created a disciplined state, and outmaneuvered empires without industrial technology, without European allies, and without recognition. And yet, history books call him a tyrant. They erase his accomplishments. They reduce him to a footnote. But we know better. We see the receipts. We feel the power of his legacy. So what happens when we reclaim that knowledge? When we study his strategies, honor his vision, and apply his principles in the modern world? Imagine an African diaspora and continent armed not just with history, but with understanding, disciplined, united, strategic, and unbreakable. The lie of inferiority crumbles when the truth is embraced. The brilliance they tried to bury rises. And here's the final awakening. Shaka's genius wasn't just about battles, it was about reclaiming agency, teaching resilience, and proving that African minds have always been capable of shaping history, governance, and culture. The blueprint is ours. It has always been ours. And the moment we truly see it, remember it, and use it, nothing, not lies, not centuries of erasure, not the narratives forced upon us, can stop the resurgence of our power. So ask yourself one last time, if one man could unite clans, outthink empires, and build a nation that resisted colonial powers, what happens when an entire continent remembers that genius? What happens when we finally write our own story, on our own terms, without apology, without distortion, and without erasure? The answer is ours to create, and Shaka is still leading the way. This is Shaka Zulu, the military genius, the nation builder, the mind they feared to teach you about. And now, you know the truth.